In our ongoing look at sports science for paddling, we've looked at the human energy systems and how they interact to produce the energy necessary for the muscle contraction that we use or need when we're paddling. We've looked at VO2 max and we've looked at its implications on performance. And today I would like to talk about something called the lactate or the anaerobic threshold. The simplest definition of lactate threshold is it's the exercise intensity at which lactate begins to accumulate in the bloodstream more quickly than it can be cleared away. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a review here to illustrate what the lactate threshold is. When we're working at level 2 or level 3, we're working fairly easily. We're working aerobically. The ATP necessary for muscle contraction in our muscle fibers, right, is being produced by aerobic means. It means that there's enough oxygen being delivered to the working muscles to produce the ATP aerobically, right? There is no limit to the amount of time that this energy system can produce energy. So it's great in that regard. We could go all day, and there are no negative byproducts produced. The problem is that as our exercise intensity increases, so as we start to paddle harder and harder and harder, our intensity, our heart rate goes higher and higher and higher, we reach a point where the demand for oxygen in the muscle so that it can continue with this aerobic metabolism becomes greater than our body's ability to deliver oxygen to the muscle. Okay, so the demand completely outpaces or outstrips our body's ability to deliver oxygen. And in that instance, our body's got a great solution to it, and that's that it starts to produce energy anaerobically. Okay, so it doesn't tell us we don't have to slow down. Our anaerobic system just kicks in and starts to produce energy anaerobically so that we can continue to paddle at a higher and higher intensity. The problem with the anaerobic system is that as it's producing the ATP, it's also producing something called lactic acid. And lactic acid is a limiting factor to performance. As lactate increases and increases and increases, it reaches a point where it will eventually cause muscle failure. And so we have to eventually slow down and stop working anaerobically, or else we're going to end up more or less dead in the water, okay? So we're really interested in knowing where exactly this change from production of energy solely by aerobic means to the introduction of anaerobic production of energy occurs. We're really interested in what intensity that occurs at. We can find it out by doing some simple testing. We call it a lactate step test. And what it involves is a series of 5-minute pieces in steps, where each step is harder than the step that came before. And so the first 5-minute step might be at level 1, the second at level 2, the third at level 3, the fourth at level 4, the fifth at level 5, basically a max effort. At the end of each test, as quickly as possible, the athlete gets to either the motorboat or to shore where we can collect a sample. It's a simple pinprick of the fingertip or the earlobe. We squeeze a little blood onto a strip, a test strip that's in an analyzer, and we wait a couple of seconds, and the analyzer will tell us the value in millimoles. And so for the level 2, level 2, level 3 efforts, the lactate value is very low. It's anywhere from 1 to 3 or just over 3 millimoles. If we plot it out on a curve where there's lactate level on the x-axis and heart rate on the y-axis and heart rate on the x-axis, the low intensity efforts will be a very, very flat curve, slightly increasing over as heart rate increases, but very flat. However, when we start to test the values from the blood from the level 4 and level 5 efforts where the intensity is increasing, where the heart rate is increasing, suddenly we start to see lactate values that are much higher. Could be 5 millimoles, 6 millimoles, 8 millimoles, 10, 12. Some of the top athletes in the world get up to 16, 18 millimoles of lactate in their bloodstream. It's not so much the amount of lactic acid that we're interested in. It's more the point at which the heart rate, at which this transition from solely aerobic metabolism to suddenly the introduction of the anaerobic metabolism starts to occur. Okay, we're interested in the point. Look, what we'll do is we'll graph it out and we'll see this nice flat slope where we're working aerobically. And then as the anaerobic system kicks in and large amounts of lactate are being produced, we'll see the lactate values rapidly increase. So the curve will look like this. And we're interested in that inflection point where the slope goes from relatively flat to very, very steep. That inflection point represents, if we find out what the heart rate is at that point, it represents the lactate threshold heart rate. And that's a very important piece of information for an athlete and a coach to know. So for the athlete, if they know that value and they have a heart rate monitor that they can take with them in a race, they can know exactly what heart rate they can work at and still be working aerobically without starting to work anaerobically. And that's really important because if they didn't know that value and they were cautious and worried about not producing large amounts of lactate in a distance race, they might work at too low a heart rate, being afraid that they would be, if they worked any harder, they would start to produce large amounts of lactic acid and run into trouble. They'd essentially be leaving something on the table. But if they know the exact heart rate that they can work up to without working anaerobically, that allows them to really maximize their effort or their performance in a distance race. It's also really useful in assessing for a coach to assess an athlete's fitness level. We talked about how VO2 max is a good measure of aerobic fitness. Well, the lactate threshold is a good measure of aerobic fitness too, because essentially what it's telling us is that the higher the threshold, the greater intensity an athlete can work at and still work at aerobically. And again, that's a huge advantage for an athlete if they can work at a higher intensity and be working aerobically, while another athlete with a lower threshold would be working. One of their competitors would be working at a much lower heart rate, or would be starting to work anaerobically at a much lower heart rate. Right? It's a big advantage if you are beginning to work anaerobically at a higher intensity than your competitor. So that it's very useful to know this information, and it's also useful because it's trainable. Just like VO2 max is trainable, the lactate threshold is trainable too. So the work that you do through the course of a season should increase your lactate threshold over the course of the year. By training at or just below threshold, there's a number of adaptations that occur that improve your aerobic ability. But one of them is simply your body's ability to clear lactate increases a little bit, and it helps move your threshold to a higher heart rate. And obviously that's really important because it means that you can go at an even higher intensity before starting to deal with issues with lactic acid. And so then the other thing it can do actually is it can allow coaches to get a real handle on the effectiveness of the training program. Like your lactate threshold should be improving if you're doing the type of work that best trains it. If it's not improving, then there might need to be some adjustments to the program. The other thing it can do is it can help an athlete. It can help indicate the onset of overtraining or the early stages of overtraining, because if you're if you've been training really hard and your lactate threshold is suddenly, when you do a test, is suddenly going the wrong way, it's getting the heart rate at which you're reaching threshold is getting lower, it could be an indication of overtraining, neuromuscular fatigue, that type of thing. So it's really useful to do this test a few times in the paddling season. You maybe do it once in the spring to get a baseline in May. You do it again maybe in July, again in August or September, depending on when your major event of the season is. But it can really help you zero in and better define your training zones as well, so that you are always know that you're training at the optimal level. And as I said, not leaving something on the table when you should be doing like a level 4 at a heart rate of, say, 175 or something, and you're doing it instead at 165 because you aren't aware of where your threshold is. It can really help you better nail down your training zones. So it's a very valuable tool. It's something that is relatively easy to test if you have the analyzer and the test strips. It's something that we test at Paddle Monster. We'll be running a number of these tests for athletes this summer. If you're interested, stay tuned. We'll be providing you with more information about it. But that's a quick look at lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold. It's quite important. I invite you to do some research on it yourself and learn more about it. But stay tuned for more information about testing that we offer, and I'll talk to you again next time.